Before we talk about the chapter, A Driver for Ildirim's Arabs, meaning his Arabian racing horses, not the Arabs that follow Sheikh Ildirim as human beings. Before we begin that chapter, which has a title obviously pointing forward to the chariot race, we'll talk about the two chapters in between quickly. They focus a lot on Malach, the man who followed Ben-Hur into the Grove of Daphne and the Fountain of Castalia area. Malach, as I said, also a Jew, was sent by Simonides to see what kind of man Ben-Hur is, and we have a chapter where he reports back to Simonides. What this leads to eventually, later on in the novel, is Simonides deciding to trust Judah Ben-Hur, to believe he is who he says he is, and to present him all of his father's wealth, which is an amazing, huge amount of money. What Ben-Hur does with that wealth, we find out at the very end of the novel. We'll come to that in the last video. Now, there's a little complication in the film here which does not take place in the book. Ben-Hur is told that his mother and sister are dead in the movie. Then he is told by Messala when dying that they are alive and they are lepers. Ben-Hur's mother and sister, as we all remember if we'd seen the film, are lepers. When they are let out of prison, it is found that they have caught leprosy, which probably infected the very walls of the prison cell, just as in Old Testament descriptions in the book of Leviticus, leprosy could infect the walls of a building. This becomes extremely important for the rest of the novel. It is, of course, if you know the story, the miracle or the root of the miracle which Jesus performs for Ben-Hur's family. Once again, it happens a little differently in the movie, and in this case, I think that the filmmakers had the right idea more than Wallace did, as in the cheating in the chariot race. Happens differently in the movie from the way it does in the book, but we will talk about that in the final video. The point is, at this point, Ben-Hur has no idea that his mother and sister are lepers. He finds out much later in the book that they ever were than he does in the film. The reason he cannot kill Messala, therefore, is because Messala knows the truth, and he explains that to Malach. He would like revenge, but he cannot have revenge to death because he wants to know about his mother and sister. Malach then tells Ben-Hur that Ildirim talked to Simonides and said he had found a strange story. 3 men called at Ildirim's tent out in the wilderness, it says in 349. They are all foreigners, a Hindu, a Greek, and an Egyptian, and they come on camels. And then they asked him, where is he that is born King of the Jews? And they went to Bethlehem, and of course, as was discussed before, this is the story of the 3 magi. Ildirim himself, who has these great Arab racing horses, the 4 horses that will pull Ben-Hur's chariot in the race. Balthazar, who was one of the 3 wise men, and Ben-Hur have a meal, which is always a big thing for an Arab. I've eaten with Arabs. Their culture has a lot to do with the hospitality of the enormous meals that they are meant to serve people. And following that, a long discussion about Jesus and about Balthazar's experiences in meeting him, about Balthazar's continuing to seek him afterward, leading to the final thoughts in Book 4 and in our reading of Ben-Hur. Sheikh Ildirim is certainly a man out of legend or out of a remake of Lawrence of Arabia. Wallace really pours it into the description of him. He is a prince and a patriarch. He is rich in the way that matters in the desert and did in the Old Testament, in money, but also in camel, horses, flocks. He has a large following, and he's known as Sheikh Ilderim the Generous, and certainly shows that to Ben-Hur. He also has a grievance against Rome. They have stolen some money from him, but when Ben-Hur meets him, he says, "I am not a Roman, I am a Jew, with a grievance against Rome, compared with which thine is not more than a child's trouble," he says near the bottom of 354, and he says, "I swear if you give me the revenge I seek, the money and the glory of the race shall be thine." In other words, give me your horses to run this chariot race. I promise you I will win, you'll get the money, and I'll get the revenge. Which, of course, is exactly what happens. First we have Sheikh Ilderim showing off his horses, showing how much he loves them. The horses actually come into the tent practically. He calls them Arabs because they're Arab racing horses, as that breed still is called. And as I said before, there's a lot of romance and kind of Arabian Nights mythology connected to this. In James Joyce's story Araby, where the Arab bazaar that the Irish boy wants to go to represents romance and an exciting far-off world, his uncle starts to recite the poem "The Arab's Farewell to His Steed," because the relationship between Arabs and their horses in the desert is so familiar. I actually know that poem. My mother had it in a book of poetry. And Ilderim even has these tablets in which is written the pedigree of the horses and all their sires, etc. And that's why Ben-Hur says in 356, "In the love of an Arab, his horse is next to his children. The Arab horses are the best in the world." All of this is part of Lew Wallace's attempt to give a full picture of the culture, of the time and place. One of the reasons perhaps why he's in the realism section of our book, even though I think this is too fantastic a story to be a realist one, in the sense of fantasy and drama and a Scott-like sweep, not in the sense of being totally great. He then meets Balthazar there. They introduce each other a little bit more. Again, Ben-Hur has to explain that he is a Jew and not a Roman. And it's after that that the really important conversation in this book of Ben-Hur begins. Then begins the conversation which, as far as the theological meaning of Ben-Hur, rather than any of the story drama that we basically focused on in the last video, then begins the conversation which is, in that sense, the climax of Book 4 and thus of our reading. I think there's an important paragraph on page 358, just before the chapter title Balthazar Impresses Ben-Hur. "With such a company, an Arab, a Jew, and an Egyptian, all believers alike in one God, there could be at that age but one subject of conversation," and that is, of course, the coming of the Messiah, of Jesus, whom Balthazar has actually seen. "An Arab, a Jew, and an Egyptian, all believers alike in one God." As I said before, that was a pretty unusual thing of that time. Today, of course, Arabs are monotheists through Islam, whatever is believed of the God that they profess. Egyptians are Arabs, but in those days, Egyptians were a different race. Only today, centuries and centuries later, has Egypt become an Arab country. A Jew, a believer in one God, certainly, if he is a faithful Jew, and Ben-Hur was, as we have heard already. But that was a very strange gathering for that time, and now they were talking about what Balthazar had seen. Malach had earlier reported to Simonides that the words "born to be king of the Jews" were very important in Balthazar's story. Not to be king of the Jews, but born to be king. Why is that such an important difference? Because King Herod was a king imposed by the Romans. He was basically a puppet of the Romans, and therefore so were his heirs, such as the Herod of the death of John the Baptist in the Salome story, and Herod the Great's other two heirs that were ruling at that time. In fact, they weren't even Jews. They were Idumeans. I'm not sure if I said that right, but they were descended from the land of Edom, one of Israel's enemies in the Old Testament. Only a Herod, as Ben-Hur said, only a puppet of Rome, could be supposedly king of the Jews while Rome lasts. Therefore, if someone who is not merely destined to be the king, but is born to be the king exists, then that means that Rome is going to fall, that there will be a true Jewish kingdom, which of course is what the Jews expected from the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. What was promised to David, your kingdom will be established forever. They saw that, of course, in a literal sense. They saw it in a worldly sense. There is no reason for us to expect them to think anything else. How could they have known that Jesus was establishing a completely different kind of kingdom? As he said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. In this chapter excerpt, Balthasar tells the story that, of course, we already know and is very familiar. And on page 359, Wallace gives us the background that I've talked about. In the middle of the first column, he laid hold of the circumstances with a purely Jewish mind. He had always heard of the Messiah. The prophets had foretold of him in the synagogues, in the schools, in the temple. Again and again he had grown up hearing that the Messiah was to come. We need to imagine what that would be like. Today, as Christians, we grew up hearing that the Messiah had come, that Jesus is the anointed one, which is what Christ means, that he was the one anointed with the Holy Spirit by his Father, as the New Testament tells us, that he came thousands of years ago and fulfilled his mission in defeating death and the devil. What a difference from what the Jews were expecting. His father followed the faith of the Sadducees, it says in the last paragraph on 359. Now, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees opposed Jesus and questioned him and made things difficult for him. So it might be easy to confuse them and think they're about the same. In fact, the Sadducees, as it says, were liberals. They denied the soul, and in fact, they denied the resurrection. As one of the Gospels says, the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection. And in that they were different from the Pharisees, who were more conservative, more into a destiny, an immortal destiny for our soul, but of course in over-following and over-strictly following the law to achieve that. Ben-Hur's father, in other words, belonged to a very firmly believing sect. He had told Ben-Hur about this, and the child, could it be, as it says on the next page, could it be that he was the Messiah? Where was the child now? The child would be about 33 years old now, just like Ben-Hur roughly is. What's he doing now? Well, Ben-Hur does find out. He does meet Jesus several times. He and his mother and sister, of course, meet him in the very dramatic way that is seen in the film. But Ben-Hur meets him a few other times in scenes that I think are not depicted in the film. And so in the final video that we'll do on Ben-Hur, we will really fully focus on how Lew Wallace's novel is a tale of the Christ.